This is sort of a misnomer, I guess. It actually should be China in the future. The Japanese stuff will cover after we go through Japan, because Japan's future is not really. Japan and China impact each other, but the directions they're going and what they're choosing to do are entirely separate. The Japanese stuff won't make any sense until we've gone through the Japanese material. So, anywho's, um, China's an interesting situation. First, you have to remember that China between 1600 and 1911 was being under foreign occupation in the sense that the Manchurians came down in the 1600s, wiped out the Ming Dynasty, and took over and started the Qing Dynasty. So from 16, I don't know, I can remember 1615, whatever it is, till 1911, China was under Manchurian occupation, the Qing, and this led to a very strange situation. China has been under foreign occupation before, the Yuan dynasty, which is the Mongol dynasty. Think of Marco Polo and Kublai Khan and stuff like that. But those tended to be fairly short, 150, maybe 200 years. And they were always within the context of sort of like China under isolation. So foreigners came in, took over China, rattle, rattle, thump, thump, and eventually the Chinese population would rise up and throw them out. Um, the huge difference with the Qing dynasty is between, like maybe 100 something years after the Qing come to power in the 1700s, then the Europeans start to get involved. And this is the first time in thousands of years that China had to deal with foreigners who you couldn't ignore, in the sense that they had enough power, enough technology, enough whatever, that they could be very insistent about staying in your face about stuff. So China isn't able to resolve its own issues internally for the first time, probably maybe forever. And so what happens is the Qing dynasty ends up in sort of a triangle of political complexity. On one hand, it has the Europeans who increasingly see China first as a source of access to advanced technology, porcelain, silk, stuff like that the Europeans didn't really have, didn't have any way to get. Um, and really not much to trade for, to be honest. There really wasn't much that outside of China that the Chinese government or even the Chinese population was particularly interested in. So sort of like a one-way street. So the Europeans resort very quickly to military force as a way to basically take what they want, since they can't do it through, a classic example of trade. Secondly, is you have the relationship of the Qing with endemic Chinese. Think of the Han Chinese. The Qing right from the get-go were real aggressive. And as far as I know, this is the first time in the Yuan, there's nothing like this. But in the Qing dynasty, the Qing were very, well, they weren't subtle, but they were very pervasive in reminding the Chinese that they were second-class citizens in their own world. So all these rules, like I mentioned before, the little pillbox hat, the queue, all this type of stuff that only the Chinese had to do. That you couldn't be a functional decision-making member of the Chinese bureaucracy unless you were Manchurian. That the Chinese bureaucracy ran underneath Manchurian political and social control. So the Chinese bureaucratic system persists, but now it's got this overlay above it of social political control that's entirely outside of its purview. In other words, passing the civil service exam got you into the bureaucracy, but it didn't get you into decision making. That was limited to the Manchurian families, like the Manchurian clans. So this is the first time this happens, that there becomes a total separation, if you would, between the Chinese slash bureaucratic slash Han on one hand, and the decision making authority of the Manchurian, Qings on the other. And so what happens, not surprisingly, is this very quickly just leads itself to enormous abuse by the Manchurians. And you get all these Chinese uprisings, revolts, if you would, against Manchurian authority. I think the first one was with like 2 years of when the Manchurians take over. And I remember seeing somewhere, I can't remember where, that in the period of Qing, the Qing dynasty, there wasn't more than 5 years when there was a major uprising somewhere in China against Qing authority. So the Qing are never, Han Chinese never buy into the idea that the Qing should be an authority. So it isn't like the Ming or the Song or the Tang or some of the other Chinese dynasties, where to a certain extent the majority population obviously brings them to power, then is also sort of acquiescent in that they deserve to have power. The Qing never get that. The Qing never get buy-in from the majority Han population. At best, the Han put up with the Qing because they can't figure out how to get rid of the Qing, but the Qing never become a Chinese dynasty. And they intentionally don't want to be, right to the end of the time, right to 1911. They're very clear they're different. You can see this if you look images of the Shishi or the imperial court, where they're dressed in Manchurian outfits, Manchurian hairdos, especially for the women and stuff like that, making it very clear that you're not Chinese. So what this means is when that collapses in 1911 and the Chinese Republic starts up and the various warlords come to power, in other words, the classic Civil War period of Chinese, repeating history. It's within this new context that you have other outside forces involved, i.e. the Europeans. And so what happens is this makes it, and especially as we'll see the Japanese especially. And so what this means is that Chinese Han identity, for the first time that I can think of, really sort of becomes something new. It becomes more of a nationalistic overtones, both to get rid of the Qing first, and then secondly, to get rid of the European / Japanese influence, so that China can, quote, be China again. And this is a huge part of what goes on from 1911 to 1949. And this is why I mentioned earlier in talking about history that World War II really starts in 1937. And it starts when the Japanese invade China in a very calculated and just brutally, depressing way. And so the end result is when the dust finally settles and the Republic of China has been thrown out of China and ends up in the island of Taiwan, when the Chinese Communist Party comes to power, it's a very different thing than the preceding periods of Chinese centralized control. For one thing, it's happening a lot faster. Chinese civil wars seem to almost invariably last about 200 years. The civil war, in China goes from 1911 to 1949. So what, 30, 40 years. So it's a lot shorter. My sneaking suspicion would be is this means a lot of issues that would normally get sorted out don't. Having said that, when the Chinese Communist Party comes to power, they go through this absolutely brutal sort of cleansing of the past, if you would. Like I mentioned earlier, they get rid of all the religious institutions, especially Confucianism is outlawed. They get rid of the idea of land ownership. This is the first time this actually occurs in Chinese history. You have no land ownership. And so everything becomes communal. Among other things, they decide very early on that landlords, i.e. people that owned property, were basically the enemy of the Chinese state. And so they execute hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, and the remainder are put into re-education camps, concentration camps in various parts of, border China. And so what happens is they come to power in 1949, what I would call riding the tiger. This is a classic Chinese euphemism for, getting on the back of a popularist movement. So think of the tiger as being some populist movement that you really want to do. And what happens is you end up riding the tiger. So on one hand, you become the face, the voice, the image of this populist movement. But on the other hand, the classic Chinese saying is getting on the tiger is easy. Getting off is really hard. And this is what the Chinese Communist Party is facing now in the 21st century is how do you get off of the tiger without getting eaten by the tiger? They come to power, their power base, we won't get into technical aspects, but their power base by the early mid-1930s, when they're competing with Republic under Kuomintang China in the Civil War, is very quickly they realize it starts as an intellectual movement, just like its Russian counterpart, very quickly shifts, unlike its Russian counterpart, to a rural movement. The Chinese Communist Party comes to power and gains its strength in the 30s and 40s by basically working and becoming the voice and image of the workers, as they say, the peasants and the workers. So the vast, rural majority population of China becomes their power base. The Kuomintang, the Republic of China never figures this out. They stay the party of the if you would, the middle class, the literati and stuff like that. And that, that never has been how China resolves its problems. Invariably, Chinese dynasties come to power off the peasants and workers, whether it be the Tang or the Song or whoever. So the communists, picked that up. I would credit Zhou Enlai, who was sort of the intellectual powerhouse of the Communist Party, as the one that sort of figures out that pathway. Mao Zedong is he's the guy that rides the tiger, if you would. He's the face of the Communist Party, but Zhou Enlai was sort of the intellectual power behind him. And I think they studied past Chinese history and sort of figured out, if you want to make a political movement a success, who do you have to PR? And so they very quickly make this their image, the peasant worker. And this is a huge part of the Chinese, even the definition of the state in the 1949 Central Address is based on this idea of the peasant and worker. And so this becomes the party, and the party becomes China, and Mao Zedong becomes the rider of the tiger. And so that works. Despite the enormous screw ups that the Communist Party did, they killed millions of people just through moving people around, doing all sorts of stupid stuff when it comes to getting rid of agricultural systems and just mindlessly dumb stuff. But the population doesn't rise up and protest against this, which is what would have happened in the past. You would have ended up with the second round of civil wars, but they don't. The Communist Party ends up, keeping power. Now, as I mentioned before, when we talk about history, as Mao passes away, his wife tries to take over authority, become the new empress, if you would. That falls apart. She doesn't have the political backing. And what happens is Deng Xiaoping comes to power as the replacement. He is an interesting figure. You don't see a lot about him now because Xi Jinping has been very good at getting rid of his image. But he literally was almost killed in prison by Mao in his later years, but especially Mao's wife just hated Deng Xiaoping. She saw him as a threat, not surprisingly, and basically almost killed him. So he's tortured, everything like that. Survives. When she's dumped out of power, they pull him out of prison and basically make him the new leader of the Chinese state. Smart choice, a smart guy. He's the one that starts the new slogan, "Get wealthy, make money." But there's a deal with this. In other words, he tells the peasants and workers, okay, now you can lease property. In China, you still can't own property. No one owns property. The party owns the property. Or if you want to, the Chinese population owns property. You can get leases, usually 75, I think it's usually 76 years, but I think maybe in some cases 100. And so if you're a farmer, you lease land from the collective. And then you pay your lease rent, whatever you're going to call it. But the deal that he makes with the Chinese population, he tells you, okay, you've suffered under Mao. You had all these screw ups. You had the horrendous, red book period of the 60s and 70s. Now the schools are back open. We're going to get back on our feet. We're going to try to pretend that period of time was just like a real bad, headache or hangover. So we're going to move to a new collective China. Still collective. You guys can make money. You can sort of not quite own property. But the deal is you stay out of politics. It's going to be a one-party system. The Communist Party is going to run it, and Deng Xiaoping is the head of the Communist Party. So you guys can do whatever you want economically, but just no politics. And folks are okay with this. Anything was better than the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s. And they jump on it. Like I've mentioned before, Chinese are incredibly optimistic. And so if you give them half an opportunity to get ahead, they'll jump all over it. So what happens is everyone gets on board with this wealthy make money thing and getting out of politics. Yeah, who wanted to be involved in politics? So they're like, that's fine. What happens, and not surprisingly, is depending on your connection, since the folks in the party, of course, are in politics, but they also think, well, if I'm in the party, then I should be able to even easier get wealthy and make money. So you end up with both a staggering amount of corruption, the growth of the idea of Guanxi as being a economic network pathway to connections between party political power, and this increasing growth of wealth in the new managerial production elites, especially because once China opens up, then as they still are, they become sort of the production center for the planet. And so what happens is not surprisingly with all this, it becomes real quickly a staggering gap between the folks that are actually in charge of production or doing the making stuff and the mass majority of people that are actually on the line, making stuff or digging up stuff or growing crops or whatever. Ironically, the vast majority of workers and peasants don't do, at least initially, don't do all that much better in this new system. But now that they have the potential to be successful, and a huge number of them do become successful, relatively speaking, no one's going to question it. It's just a matter, if you have your act together, you can make something of yourself type thing. And so what happens is all of this works for a while. And then what happens is, of course, not surprisingly, is in the same situation, and is eventually the corruption gets. And the weird thing about this is what happens is it's sort of like this becomes like a compressed or fast forward version of typical Chinese history. Civil War, Chinese Communist Party comes to power. Again, your populist movement. And then what usually happens is a couple of generations of leaders, sort of follow the rules and fulfill the promises. And then what happens eventually is the folks in charge get used to having power and then end up with, enormous increase in corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Communist Party goes from, taking control to getting control to corruption in the space of like 40 years. So what usually would take maybe 100, 200 years, in the Tang Dynasty took about 150. Here it happens in like 3 times faster. And so by the 1990s, what's happening is people are seeing their ability to get ahead being sort of compromised. And the idea of the rectification of name, that the people in authority, which of course in this case is going to be the Communist Party, because politics is their kuleana. They run the country. That's supposed to sort of, at least the fiction of that is supposed to stay in place for a while. I mean, rectification of name was never followed in any bureaucracy like the American bureaucracy today. But nonetheless, there was the idea that it should. And there should be at least some folks that you can sort of say as poster child, this person's good at their job, they care about the people they're in charge of, et cetera, et cetera. What happens is the Communist Party sort of whizzes through that in less than one generation. And so what happens is by the 1990s, late 1990s, this whole rectification of name, people are having a really hard time finding anyone who's actually doing their job in the Communist Party versus collecting huge amounts of bribes, et cetera. And more this becomes a source of complaint, ironically, from the new elites. Your new bureaucrat, your new money managers that run the country, companies and stuff like that, start to complain that even in their situation, the bribes are increasing by the year, by every 6 months. Last time I've been to Shanghai in 20 years, but some of the folks there were complaining they were having to re-bribe the same guy every 6 months because the last bribe wasn't big enough. And so what happens is the system just gets out of control really quickly. There's no one seems to be saying, hey, wait a second, if we start to compromise the reason for our existence, we could go right back to another round of wars, of internal conflict. And so what happens is no one seems to be trying to rectify that situation. Just it sort of really quickly scales out of control. Now, what you also have is with Deng Xiaoping coming to power, actually even Zhou Enlai, he never gets much interest. But the interesting thing is he's responsible, for example, for the sort of revitalization of Chinese history. He was fascinated with both the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. And so he spends a fair amount of his leverage, as the number 2 in the Communist Party under Mao, to sort of bring back Chinese history. Because I think originally, I think Mao was a literature, because they were both teachers. Mao, I think, was a literature specialist, if I remember. But Zhou Enlai was originally a historian. So when he comes to power, he sort of mitigates a lot of the, Cultural Revolution stuff against some of the historic stuff. And then the minute that dust dies down, his followers, and then the late 70s, early 80s, start to bring back this idea of Chinese history, which, initially is just, that's a good way for Chinese to reunify themselves and give themselves a sense of internal identity. Um, the Communist Party probably makes a huge mistake uh, in the 80s because they're so fixated in this idea of let's make the country economically successful and that'll stop all the whining and complaining from folks, that I don't think they really understand or understood the importance of religion, which actually sort of makes sense because traditionally Chinese history has sort of downplayed the role of religion in its relationship to central authority. In part, like I mentioned earlier, you have the Shinto, or I should the the Buddhist, and you have the Taoist and such. So you have religions in China, but they're always seen as sort of marginal to the state. The Chinese Communist Party was set up under a different thing, and I think this is explicitly Mao. He really set up the Chinese Party as a religion. So he decides early on, I think right from in fact, even before he comes to power, I think by the late 30s, he already come to the conclusion that if the Communist Party was going to be successful, it had to be religious. People had to believe in the party. It wasn't enough to sort of have the party in control. So the Communist Party is a different type of animal than the groups that come to power in the past. Um, and somehow in the 80s, they forgot that. So what happens is in the 80s and early 90s, you start to see these frictions as religions either start up, Falun Gong being the most famous. I'm not even sure what those guys are up to now. But also just the role of Tibetan Buddhists, specifically the Dalai Lama. We'll get a little bit more into the whole Tibet issue in a sec, but the idea that you can have Buddhism being a political force sort of seems to catch the Communist Party by surprise. I think maybe they were so ethnocentric and egocentric that it never occurred to them that people would look for a religious alternative to the Communist Party. Falun Gong, I think, shocked them the most. That was a direct threat to the state. Um, as I mentioned when I was talking about religious stuff, Famen Temple and the discovery that you actually have, what appear to be historic bones of Siddhartha Buddha in China. So you get this growth of religious tourism just sort of freaks out the Communist Party because they don't know what to do with it. It never occurred to them that religion could have political overtones, I don't think. The Catholic Church, to a much lesser extent, the Catholic Church never is really an issue inside of China because, very small proportion of the population is Catholic, incredibly small. But for consequences outside of China, external to China relationships, the Catholic Church becomes an issue because people outside of China, start to critique the CCP, because of the way it's treating the Catholic Church and such like that. Not that the Chinese really care what the outside world thinks about them most of the time, anyways. But you don't want to score negative points for no reason. Probably the biggest sort of confusion of all this is, ironically, tourism in general. Tourists come to China. China starts to encourage tourists. Huge number of tourists start to pour into China. And a lot of the stuff they want to look at is basically in one way, shape, or form religious. It's the Shaolin temples, which are Buddhist temples. It's the Wild Goose pagodas in Xi'an, which are again Buddhist temples. There's the large Tibetan shrines. And so what happens is the tourism industry, which is still hugely important in China, is basically saying, hey, religion's good. Look at the amount of money we're making off of it. But the CCP is saying, well, no, wait a second. Is this going to be a threat to our authority, to the state? And so what happens is religion and the belief system of the CCP start to come into conflict, and the CCP doesn't really know how to handle it. So per usual in China, if you don't know how to handle something, you just hit it with a ton of bricks. And so they go after all this and basically make a mess of it. And so what happens is the Chinese start to end up, the Chinese state of the CCP really sort of comes to maturity, if you would, in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. But it starts to unravel within 10 years in terms of what would normally take like 100, 150 years where things start to sort of, lose their cohesion. This is happening in China in the space of less than 15, 20 years. And so this is probably the big issue in China is the role of the CCP. Um, what is it, for one thing? Because by the 1980s, 1990s, it had become not only the only way to get into power, but it was also the best way to make money because you didn't have to do anything for it. You just had to network with people or be this, you were the person people called up to make sure something happened or to make sure something didn't happen. Um, and so what happens is the party very quickly becomes so mercenary that I would argue the vast majority of senior party members sort of forget that they needed popularistic backing. They sort of think, well, this is the way things should always be. And the weird thing is those guys literally came to power from nothing. So it wasn't like it was their grandpa or, it wasn't like it had some generations. This is just within individuals' personal memory. They start to, change their view of who they are and their relationship with the world around them. So what happens here is and I think one of the side effects, again, of this idea of wealth and prosperity, but stay out of politics, is that more and more Chinese become focused on the idea of what would now be called the nuclear family in the rest of the world. So the individual and family are the ones that are going to be successful. Ironically, this is one of the side effects of not having people own property. Because people lease property in the Chinese system, they figure the easiest way is an individual does the lease. So what they ironically bring in is sort of a Western concept of the individual or nuclear family being the landholders or the business holders versus the classic Chinese system, which would have been the clan. Certainly don't have that, at least in the business world that I'm familiar with in China. And I don't remember ever hearing anyone talk about this in terms of like agricultural ownership. So clans don't own stuff in China. In fact, clans don't, I think, even legally exist at all in China. So what happens is this becomes something entirely new. Now, it wasn't part of the intent of the Communist Party, I don't think. I think it was just it was easiest to do it this way. So it just sort of happens. And so what happens is that for the first time in Chinese history, individuals or the immediate family become the centerpiece of success, authority, acquisition, failure, you name it. So the last classic Chinese system of the last name, that the people who you're networked with, suddenly sort of not really disappears per se, but it becomes a lot more superficial, a lot more marginal compared to the immediate family. And I think, again, the hukou is a good example of this. The hukou is an individual document. The government tracks you as an individual. On one hand, they're concerned about your family. But you have to remember in Chinese history, right through to 1949, if you did something wrong, the government could and very frequently would arrest your entire extended family and punish them too. So you weren't seen as an autonomous individual. You were part of a collective. And ironically, under the Communist Party idea of collective, the collective expands to everyone. And so on the other hand, it shrinks to the individual, if that makes sense. And so what happens is the other side effect of this is because everyone's making money and the government, at least in the short term, sees this as like a good idea, is they really don't think through as far as I can tell, any of the implications of this, which is sort of odd because Chinese history and even the Communist Party loves to deal with social engineering. This was a huge part of what Mao was into. And so it's sort of odd that they sort of lose this track entirely in terms of what are the social and even environmental impacts of suddenly shifting access to wealth, prosperity, et cetera, to the level of the individual. And this is something they still haven't come up with a collective thing. Every 6 months or a year, they come up with some other bright idea that the party sort of says, well, this is what everyone in China should do. And to be honest, the vast majority of folks that I know just sort of go like, yeah, whatever. And as long as you don't do anything in opposition to it visibly, everyone just ignores it. So the Communist Party really has sort of lost any credibility or sense of control over where China is going socially. And this has huge implications, as we'll see, because what it means is China post-Deng Xiaoping, especially under Xi Jinping, really doesn't have a direction or a goal. internally. It's not even like Trump's "Make America Great Again." China would argue it already has made itself great again. And compared to the Cultural Revolution they have, it's been a stunning change in China in the last 100 something years. Having said that, what does great mean? You know, uh, who defines? What are your measures? Who gains, who loses in that context? And the government has no coherency in this. A classic example would be the idea of marriage. Chinese populations dropped radically with the single child rule of the 50s and 60s, which made sense. People were having too many babies. China was entirely dependent on its internal agricultural system, and basically they weren't growing enough food to keep people fed. And so you have to start controlling the population, otherwise China's going to literally eat itself out of its own country. And so they do a really, if anything, too good job of this. And of course, China being China, it's not handled impartially. In China, what happens is basically, since sons inherit, and even still in today's world, families are dependent on their children to take care of them when they get old. There is sort of a social security system, but basically it's what they call the one pack system. It's your social security payments per month are enough to buy a pack of cigarettes. So in China, everyone still depends on their family to take care of the old folks and to rear the children. And so what happens is that the government stays out of this. Now, this isn't unique to China, but it's real handy because a huge part of the American budget, even more so European budgets, are taken up with Social Security. The government starts to get involved in the idea of taking care of old folks or supporting old folks and public education and all that stuff. And immediately you can just hear the screaming as the tax base starts to take it on the chin as there's these enormous expenses. So what happens is when the Chinese end up with this one child rule and the number of kids shrink, families immediately figure, well, I got to have sons because there's still the Chinese logic that daughters move to some other family. So what you get is a huge amount of female infanticide, either by killing the infant. Much more frequently, what happens is that when they go in for a test and they find it's going to be a girl, they basically have an abortion. And so what happens, you end up with this very skewed, demographic by the 1970s, 1980s of more boys than girls being born. This has become a nightmare issue in China in 2026. But one of the side effects is the government doesn't spend any time on this. Once they've set up the system, I think, okay, we've got that problem solved. They sort of check that box and just wander off from it. By the 1980s, it's becoming real clear that you've got a new demographic problem, which is one, you did too good of a job. You actually have the populations dropping in terms of there aren't that many kids being born at all. And more important, and probably equally importantly, the number of sons is now vastly outweighing the number of daughters. And so the population that's now adult, by the 2015s, 2020s period, you end up with it being very hard for a lot of men, in their 20s to find a wife. And so, this has huge dynamic differences then because then the role of wife, is now an optional choice for a lot of Chinese women. And it also means that taking care of parents now becomes a problem for a single son. It used to, he'd economically do it, but his wife that he brought in would actually be the caretaker. Now that can't happen because he doesn't have a wife. The government hasn't figured out what to do about that. A couple of years ago, they came up with a guys have to be better at taking care of their parents campaign, which is sort of like this PR thing that lasted for about 3 months. I don't think anyone paid any attention to it. Then what they came up with, I think last year, was that women have to be patriotic. Women have to get married and have kids. That that did not play at all with younger women. They not only ignored it, but they were actually on social media that just blew up to the extent the Chinese government had to shut down any social media comments related to it. So the government just doesn't seem to have a clue what to do about this. So what you've got is if you go to the villages, you see these in the villages. China's got the fastest growing population that's aging, in the sense of over 60. So you go to the villages, you see tons of old folks, and you see a lot of kids. The adults in the 20 to 40-year age still in many cases move to the city or town to get cash paying jobs. Though increasingly they're coming back to the countryside because you can make a decent amount of money now as a farmer, which is the first time. But still, what you find is the villages are empty of basically what you might call working adults. But they send the kids in many cases back to the farm or back to the parents or grandparents for education and sort of managing the kids. For this increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor, and it's really striking in China when you go to some place like Shanghai or especially Shenzhen, even more so. And you go 20 miles out into the countryside and you move from wealth to, I wouldn't really call it poverty, but it certainly isn't 21st century in the space of maybe 15, 20 kilometers. Xi'an's probably the most famous of this. Xi'an is in many ways sort of not quite Silicon Valley, but it's certainly part of that along with Shenzhen. It's one of the major tech centers in China. It's also one of the educational centers. So a lot of university, a lot of high tech. It's, I think, where a lot of the Chinese military stuff gets developed. And then you go, literally, you can drive for 15 minutes outside of the city, and you're suddenly in rural villages that, people have cell phones and there's stuff like this and stuff that, but a lot of folks are still on bicycles with the cute little three-wheeled carts, and they're still farmers, and in many ways their world hasn't changed since 500 years ago. There's just this staggering gap between the wealthy and the educated and the party on one hand, and the majority population of China on the other. That, of course, is a nightmare problem for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, because that's the tiger they're trying to get off of. Finally, at some point, you have to get away from popularistic control and move to just sort of management. And they haven't figured out how to do that at all. The global economy is much more competitive, moving much more quickly than they thought it would. This is why the Chinese party continues to make a lot of, missteps in terms of what it wants to be. And probably one of the classic examples of this is under Xi Jinping. Chinese traditionally, foreign policy in China has always been really interesting because on one hand, China always has this fear of being invaded by the outside. Of course, it has happened. The Mongols come in. To a certain extent, the Qin come in over 2,000 years ago. And more recent, of course, the Qing, which are, recent memory. That's 150 years ago. Take over the country for 3 centuries. And then, of course, you have more recently have the Europeans. To the Chinese view, the most famous would be the British and the Opium Wars. And so what you have is these external forces. But to a certain extent, China's always seen the outside world as there's nothing to be gained from the outside world. And so what you want is the outside world to be disrupted. So Chinese foreign policy traditionally, from the Han, even the Qin dynasty, certainly the Han dynasty on, is on one hand, you might take political control of areas outside of the main chunk of China. But what you really want to do with the folks that aren't Chinese around you on your borders is have them fighting each other, arguing with each other. So, you get the Koreans to go after other parts of Korea. You get the Mongolians to go after other Mongolians. You get the, Persian Iranians to go after other Persian Iranians. So what you do is you basically destabilize your border or outside of your borders with the attitude, it's pretty pragmatically realistic. If your neighbors are fighting each other, they're not going to have any time to fight you, come in and give you a hard time. That's been Chinese, politics, geopolitics from day one. In the 2000s, well, I'd say actually 2010, 2015, Xi Jinping comes to power. And, he sort of comes up to power on this idea of he's going to clean up the corruption. So he sort of parlays himself as being the new rectification of name. And it doesn't really happen. What he does, he gets rid of the competition. But if you're in his part of the government, you're just as corrupt as before. And people very quickly realize nothing's really changed. His second move, and I think this is based on his relationship and his study of the post-Soviet state in Russia, is looking at Putin's, need to centralize authority in a fragmented, Russian Federation. Is Putin very quickly comes to the conclusion that if you make a threat of external enemies, quote, real, unquote, to the population, then they'll let you get away with stuff that you promised that you're going to fix inside that you don't. Xi Jinping, for some reason, I don't know why, since they didn't have the same clock ticking, decided he's going to do the same thing. So what happens is the Chinese government under Xi Jinping starts to become very, very aggressive about how it sees the outside world. And what they do is they basically, let's switch this to music. What they very quickly decide, and I don't understand the logic, and to me it was and still really is a bad idea. They decide that what they're going to do is they're going to make the outside world a threat to China. Now, this is sort of hard to swing because if you look at China, China is not only a really large place, but its borders tend to, like now, especially once it's swallowed up Tibet, basically tend to be very geopolitical or physical geography based. So, as I said, China is sort of like a bowl on three sides. And right now, the rim of the bowl is the borders of the Chinese states. They really don't have a lot to worry about. It's not like, anyone's eyeballing them and taking them over, though ironically, Russia did try as late as the early 1990s. The Chinese border with Russia here is actually the one that's most likely to flare up. In fact, has a couple of times sort of informally since then. So ironically, the guys that they like to image themselves as sort of buddies with are really their only land threat. Anyways, so what happens is he decides, well, to unify, the Chinese populace, i.e. the public, he decides that what he's going to do is promote a new China. What he does is he goes back to the early Qing dynasty, when they controlled, parts of South China Sea, and actually goes all the way back to the Han Dynasty when they actually controlled Tang and Han dynasties, where they controlled large amounts of what's now Afghanistan, Iran, and such like that. And he sort of says, well, these are China's natural borders. It makes no sense. They're not China's natural borders. And in fact, most of Chinese history, China consisted of just this core area. So, and that's, by the early 1800s, that's where the Qing had sort of shrunk back to. So there's no, unless you're going to go back, 3 to 7 to 1100 years ago, there's not really anything to base this on. It's not based on the history of 20 or 40 years ago. It's entirely a fiction of the Communist Party under Xi Jinping. Now, what they also decide is that to stabilize things with this now sort of global economic system, what they want to do is they want to have more control over more resources. Now, they don't want to have these controls to use them internally. They want to have these controls to have them as other things to sell to the rest of the world. And so what happens, this whole section down here, which is the South China Sea, has pretty enormous gas oil reserves, about the same as the Middle East. Under international law, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, which Chinese don't admit Taiwan exists, but even Japan, since the Japanese home islands go all the way down to here, Korea, all have interest in the South China Sea. And in fact, the Philippines specifically has a lot more, close access. A lot of the South China Sea, the main oil gas area is actually here. So it's closer to Indonesia and the Philippines. It's actually quite far away from China per se. And of course, if you admit Taiwan exists, then they're smack dab in the middle of it. So what he does, what Xi Jinping does, is he says, well, we've actually redefined our borders. The borders of China actually go to the furthest extent of the Tang/Qing dynasty, which, he doesn't make a big thing of this, but that includes huge amounts of North Vietnam, northern part of Vietnam, Myanmar, Nepal, Bhutan, sort of the border areas of India, huge chunks of this area here, includes all of Mongolia, most of Korea. And he says this is all our natural boundary. And so this becomes the new Chinese logic, the rhetoric that they use every day. This is the reason for the growth of the Chinese military. This is the reason for the growth of Chinese as a major global political threat seen by a lot of other countries, is the fact that he changes the view of China as being a land-based, place, which it has been for thousands of years, and starts to say, well, basically, everything east of central Afghanistan all the way over to Japan and the Philippines is ours. And we're justifying that through our interpretation of history in the past, which, fine. But I mean, if that's the case, and there's periods of time when India controlled lots of China, God knows Mongolia could say, well, all of China's ours because they controlled it under the Yuan. Manchuria, which is actually currently part of China, could spin itself off first as separate, then take over China and everything down here. They controlled all of Vietnam, a lot of Cambodia, Laos, etc. So, you start to play with historical borders. And I think if you think of what nightmare Europe would be if all of a sudden the Germans and the Frenchmen would start to spin, where our borders should be game. Um, it makes no sense. Enormous amounts of Chinese resources are being spent on generating enormous amounts of stress, enormous amounts of aggravation, enormous amounts of threat, um, for no purpose that I can see. I can't believe that just being the Chinese party actually believe that they can justify the 9-9-9 line, which is this historic thing. But they have made this a centerpiece of their geopolitics and everything else. And the end result has been they've made themselves enemies of a lot of the rest of the planet with no potential gain to it. And this is the total opposite, because traditionally Chinese foreign policy was based on the idea of get everyone else outside to ignore you so that then China can do its thing and be successful. In this case, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get everyone to notice you so that you can scare them and threaten them. And it just, for other countries that might make sense. If you're Russia and you're Putin, trying to sort of replay Imperial Russia / the Soviet Union might be the only card you've really got to play. But in the Chinese case, it really doesn't make a hell of a lot. It doesn't make any sense at all politically. It doesn't make any sense socially. It's not working. On one hand, he sort of hypes this idea that this is going to bring Chinese together, because they're going to become, quote, more patriotic, unquote. But what it doesn't seem to be doing that, and I'm amazed that he would think it would. So I don't know. Now he's actually made the tiger more hungry. And now trying to get off the tiger is going to be, I would argue, impossible, for the Communist Party. I don't know what they're going to do. I think they've actually painted themselves in this absolute nightmare of a corner. And I don't know where it's going to go, but it's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to involve just China. That I can guarantee. So what you have is that. That has now become the huge tiger in the room, if you want to. Um, the Communist Party has never actually figured out what it wants to do with the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy still exists in China, but now it's overseen by the Communist Party. So what you find is there's a governor, for example, in Shanxi province, there's a governor to the province. There's also a Communist Party head to the province, and the Communist Party head of the province actually oversees the governor. So the governor is actually the number two in the province. He's not the guy in charge of the province. They've never figured out how that works and how that plays out. They just sort of did it because they did it. So they've never actually formalized that, and that just creates an enormous amount of nightmares, especially if personalities clash. Resource access allocation, especially with the enormous growth of the military, the Chinese intentionally making themselves a threat to everything else around them. Their frictions with India are absolutely silly. And yet that's starting to consume a large amount of Chinese resources in the West, for absolutely no purpose, economically, socially, politically, whatever. So, resource allocation appears to be entirely driven by the flavor of the day. And more what's happening is the general population finds their access to resources becoming more and more limited in some ways, while their expectations are growing. They have access to more stuff and they want more stuff. And so, if you can buy stuff on Alibaba, but you can't buy anything on Alibaba because your taxes went up to pay for new military forces on the border with India, you're going to be going like, what the hell? So, again, and there's no coherent long-term policy to all this. It's very sort of like the flavor of the day type stuff, which is very much like American policy right now. The impact of digital media. Um, the Great Wall, the 21st century Great Wall in China is the Internet Great Wall. My colleagues in China can't access our Google Earth platform directly. They can if they use IP addresses, but they can't through the government approved media because the government has come up with its own version of Google Earth, which is pretty lame to put it mildly, and it crashes all the time. And that's the ones you got to use. Chinese digital media on one hand is global. TikTok is probably one of the most famous examples. On the other hand, TikTok in its Chinese version is constantly government monitored. The Chinese government monitors all internet-based communications, whether it be email, but especially any social media is constantly monitored by the government. They have probably some of the world's most sophisticated AI, which is one reason why China is really big on AI, for the purpose of providing what's called public security in China, because Chinese love their social media. They've always loved to gossip, and social media is like the 21st century way to get that done. But if you say something that you're not supposed to, you can see yourself one shut down literally in a couple of seconds as the AI suddenly tracks, target words or target phrases or images. And secondly, if it appears to be something the government is worried about, within a day or two, public security will come and talk to you. If they don't like the answers, they very likely might arrest you and your family for an unspecified period of time. Again, because you have to remember, rule of law has never been part of Asian societies. It's rule of government. So the Communist Party is the legal system. So digital media in China is entirely different than digital media outside of China. And so, concerns that other governments and groups have about Chinese wanting to access or control media, either directly or indirectly, are actually well-founded. But the interesting thing is in China, the government doesn't see like that's why that would be a problem. Of course, they should control media. That's the way things should be. So China's got itself in a very strange situation. Demographically, it's all messed up. Among other things, just as a minor note, China's got the fastest growing rate of obesity in the world of any place. They went from being basically totally non-obese to getting chunky really quick. So, you've got all these new problems showing up. And the government's done an incredibly bad job of dealing with them or even addressing them in many cases. So that's sort of China. I don't know how China's going to handle its future. I do know whatever they finally get involved in or whatever finally happens is not going to stop with China. It's going to spill over. The current assumption, which I have no reason to doubt, is that they're going to invade Taiwan, if nothing else, because they hope that's going to keep on distracting the population from the fact that they haven't really addressed the social and economic and sort of ethical issues inside of China. But I see that as being an incredibly terrifyingly dangerous way to deal with issues. But no one's ever said the Communist Party in China thinks rationally. They have an internal logic to their system, but it's not to deal with the needs of the population of China. There's always been a separation between the two.